They called it strength. The hidden cost of being the one who never falls apart. Introduction: the person this was written for. Before I say a single word about psychology or philosophy or any of the frameworks we are going to walk through together, I need to tell you who this is for. This is for the person who is everyone's first call. The one people reach for when things go wrong. The one whose name appears in other people's stories as the reason they made it through. The reliable one, the strong one, the one who shows up, who holds it together, who knows what to say and when to say it, and how to be exactly what another person needs in a moment of crisis. This is for the person who has never once in their adult life said, out loud and to someone who could actually help, "I am not okay." Not because they are lying, not because they are repressing, but because they genuinely, structurally, do not know how. The words exist in their vocabulary. The sentence is grammatically available, and yet it has never come out, not in the way it needs to, with the full weight of what it means and the expectation of being caught. This is for the person who reads the question, "How are you doing?" and already knows, before they answer, that they are going to say fine or busy or honestly pretty good considering. They are going to deflect with warmth and humor and genuine interest in the other person. They are going to make the conversation about you, because that is what they always do, and they are very, very good at it. This is for the person who, somewhere around the middle of every night, has a few quiet minutes where the performance drops and something true surfaces. Not dramatic, just a kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. A sense of carrying something heavy for a very long time that nobody else seems to notice because you carry it so well. That tiredness is what this recording is about. Not how to fix your life. Not how to become a better version of yourself. Not a 12-step program for healing the inner child, or rewiring the nervous system, or manifesting the life you deserve. Something quieter, and ultimately more radical than any of those. This is an invitation to finally understand what happened to you, what the giving cost you, and what it might feel like to receive something, just once, without immediately making it about whether the other person is okay with giving it. The science that underpins what we are going to discuss is real, the psychology is documented, studied, named, and it has been waiting for you to find it, because the moment you see the mechanism clearly, the thing that has been running your life in the background for years, the hold it has you begins to loosen. Not disappear, loosen. That is where freedom starts. Stay with me. Chapter 1. The Fawn. There are 4 responses the human nervous system has been documented to produce under threat. You have heard of 2 of them, fight and flight. They are famous. They are the responses that get written about in magazines and referenced in corporate trainings and discussed at dinner parties. Fight, the impulse to confront the danger directly. Flight, the impulse to escape it. Both of them have a kind of heroism in the popular imagination. The person who fights, the person who runs. Both are doing something. Both are moving. The third response is freeze, less heroic sounding. The deer in the headlights, the rabbit that goes perfectly still when the hawk passes overhead, the body that discovers in a moment of overwhelming threat that neither fighting nor fleeing is available, and so simply stops, shuts down, goes somewhere else internally while the external situation continues without participation. And then there is the fourth response, the one that has been known to researchers for decades and has been almost entirely absent from the popular conversation about trauma until recently. It is called the Fawn Response. It was named by the psychologist Pete Walker, who spent years working with survivors of chronic childhood trauma, and what he observed was this. For some people, particularly those who grew up in environments where the source of threat was also the source of care, where the person who hurt them was also the person they depended on for survival, neither fighting nor fleeing nor freezing was a viable option. Fighting would escalate the danger. Fleeing was impossible. Freezing was unsustainable. What the nervous system settled on instead was appeasement. Make the threat feel good. Make the threat feel comfortable. Become whatever the threat needs you to be in this moment so that it does not harm you. Smile, help, agree, anticipate the need before the need is expressed, and meet it so efficiently that there is no gap in which conflict can form. Become indispensable. Become so good at giving, so reliably useful, so perfectly attuned to what the people around you need, that harming you becomes structurally inconvenient. This is the Fawn response. And here is what is critical to understand about it. It works. In the short term, in the environment it was designed for, it is extraordinarily effective. The child who learns to fawn, to read the room, to give before being asked, to soothe before the anger surfaces, to be helpful and charming and self-effacing, that child survives in ways that the fighting child or the fleeing child often does not. The fawn response is an intelligent adaptation. It is a piece of biological engineering that deserves genuine respect. The tragedy is not that you developed it. The tragedy is that it became your only setting. The nervous system that learned to fawn in childhood did not receive the memo that the original threat environment is gone. It cannot distinguish between a parent whose moods were unpredictable and a colleague whose opinion is mildly important. It cannot distinguish between a caregiver whose approval was required for emotional survival and a friend who would, in fact, still love you, even if you said no to something they asked for. The nervous system is running an old program, a survival program, one that was absolutely correct for the conditions it was built in. And you have been running it ever since. So when people call you the strong one, the reliable one, the one who always shows up, they are right. You are. But what they are also describing, without knowing it, is a nervous system that never quite learned how to not show up. A nervous system that equates your own needs with danger, that reads the act of receiving as threatening, that has wired helping so deeply into the architecture of safety that stopping feels less like rest and more like falling. This is where it begins. Not with blame, not with grief, yet with understanding. You did not choose this. You built it to survive. And now, because you are here, because something in you reached for this, you are beginning to ask whether you still need it as badly as you thought. Chapter 2. The Education of the Helper. There is a concept in developmental psychology called parentification. It describes what happens when a child is asked, explicitly or implicitly, to perform the emotional labor of an adult within their family system. To manage a parent's moods, to mediate conflict, to carry worries that belong to the grown-ups, to be the stabilizing presence in an unstable environment. It happens in families where a parent is struggling with addiction, with mental illness, with grief, with chronic stress, with their own unhealed wounds. It happens in families where a parent simply has more emotional need than emotional resource. It happens in families that look, from the outside, perfectly functional. The parentified child learns things that most children do not have to learn yet. They learn to read a room. They learn to scan faces for early signals of emotional weather. They learn the specific art of arriving at a conversation and immediately, before speaking a single word, assessing what the other person needs from this interaction and adjusting accordingly. This is a sophisticated social intelligence. It genuinely is. The adult who was a parentified child is often extraordinarily empathic, perceptive, skilled at navigating complex human dynamics. These are real gifts. They are not small. But they come with a cost that takes years to understand. The cost is this: the parentified child never learned that their own emotional experience was the primary subject. They learned that their emotional experience was relevant only insofar as it affected others. They learned to process their own feelings quickly, to move them out of the way, to transform them from inconveniences into information that could be used in service of the people around them. They learned, in essence, to experience their inner life as a resource to be managed for other people's benefit, rather than as a reality to be inhabited for their own. The psychologist Harriet Lerner, who spent decades writing about relationships and emotional health, described a related pattern she called the overfunctioner, the person who, in any system, tends to take on more than their share of the emotional and practical labor, who naturally moves toward problems, who finds almost automatically that they are doing more than seems quite fair, not because they have been explicitly asked to, but because something in them is uncomfortable with the vacuum that appears when they do not. Overfunctioning is not a character flaw. It is a trained response to an early environment in which someone needed to function, and the available adults were not doing it adequately. And you stepped into the gap, because stepping into the gap was the available way to create safety. You have been stepping into the gap ever since. And here is what that pattern costs in the long run. Research in the field of compassion fatigue, the depletion that occurs when caregiving becomes chronic and one-directional, shows consistently that the greatest predictor of burnout is not the amount of care given. It is the absence of reciprocity. The nervous system can sustain extraordinary levels of giving if that giving is in genuine relationship with receiving. What it cannot sustain indefinitely is the one-directional flow, the always outward, never inward, the perpetual expenditure without replenishment. You have not been running low on strength. You have been running a system that was never designed to refill itself. The question worth sitting with as you listen to this is not, why am I tired? The question is more specific than that. When did you last receive something, care, attention, help, comfort, without immediately either deflecting it or holding it lightly so the other person did not feel too responsible for you? Take your time with that question. It has been waiting for a real answer for a while. Chapter 3: The Identity Trap. Here is a thing that happens to people who are very good at giving. Over time, the giving stops feeling like something they do. It starts feeling like something they are. This is one of the most important psychological shifts to understand, because it is the thing that makes changing the pattern feel less like a lifestyle adjustment and more like an existential threat. If helping is what I do, I can choose to do it differently. But if helping is who I am, then any reduction in helping feels like a reduction in myself. It feels like disappearing. The psychologist and researcher Brené Brown, whose work on vulnerability and shame has been studied across multiple institutions, describes what she calls identity armor, the story we construct about ourselves that both protects us and imprisons us. The narrative that begins as a coping mechanism and gradually hardens into a definition. I am someone who can handle things. I am someone who does not need much. I am someone people can rely on. These are not false statements. In context, in the situations where they were formed, they were accurate and useful and probably even life-saving. But the thing about armor is that it does not discriminate between the situations that require it and the situations that do not. The emotional armor of the strong one gets worn into every room, every relationship, every moment of potential vulnerability, even the moments where vulnerability would be not only safe, but genuinely good. The armor comes up automatically, before the evaluation of the situation has had a chance to complete. The armor is the default. And over time, wearing the armor in every room produces a particular kind of loneliness that is very difficult to name because it exists alongside genuine connection. You are not alone. You have people. You have relationships that are real and meaningful and full of genuine care. And yet underneath all of it, there is a distance, a glass wall. The sense of being in the room without quite being in the room. Present and yet somehow not fully seen. This is the loneliness of the person whose depth is never reached because the armor redirects every approach before it can get there. The clinical psychologist Sue Johnson, founder of emotionally focused therapy and one of the most rigorous researchers in the field of adult attachment, describes what she calls emotional accessibility, the degree to which a person can be genuinely reached by another. Her research has found that emotional inaccessibility, the pattern of deflecting, minimizing, redirecting, managing every moment of potential closeness, is not a protection from pain. It is a generator of it. The nervous system needs genuine contact. It needs the experience of being seen and remaining safe. Without that experience, regularly, it begins to treat closeness itself as the threat. The armor was built to protect you. But worn long enough, it prevents the very thing you are protecting something for. The work, and it is work, begins with the recognition that the identity of the strong one is not the whole truth of you. It is the part of you that survived, and survival is remarkable and worth honoring. But you were not built for survival alone. You were built for something more than being useful to everyone except yourself. Chapter 4. What you were never taught about receiving. In cultures oriented around productivity and contribution, which is most of the world you have lived in, receiving is quietly, persistently taught as the lesser action. Giving is virtuous. Giving is generous. Giving confirms your value and your goodness. The giver is celebrated. The receiver is, at best, grateful and, at worst, a burden. You absorbed this before you had language for it. You saw it in the way requests were handled in your family of origin, in the way help was offered and accepted or not accepted, in the value system that ran quietly beneath every interaction about who was contributing and who was consuming. And so the act of receiving became loaded with something it should not carry: shame, or the edge of shame, the slight vertigo of obligation, the immediate instinct to balance the account, to give something back as quickly as possible so that you do not feel too much in anyone's debt, to say you did not need to do that, or you are too kind, or let me do something for you. The psychologist Kristin Neff, who has produced the most comprehensive body of research on self-compassion in the academic literature, has identified a pattern she calls the double standard in care. The overwhelming majority of people, when tested, apply significantly warmer, more patient, more gentle standards to others in difficulty than to themselves. The thing you would say to your best friend who was struggling, the immediate warmth, the lack of judgment, the "you are doing your best," the "this is genuinely hard," that full-bodied compassion is available to you for everyone else. For yourself, a much harder and more demanding standard applies. This double standard is not moral weakness. It is a learned orientation, and it has a very direct, practical consequence. When you cannot receive compassion for yourself, you cannot fully receive it from others either. The offer is made and something in you deflects it before it can land. You receive the form, but not the content. The words reach you, but not the warmth behind them. Receiving is a skill. This is perhaps the most practically important thing in this entire recording. Receiving is not a passive process that happens automatically when someone gives. It requires an active capacity to stay present with being the recipient, to not immediately redirect, to not minimize the gift, to not sprint back to equilibrium by immediately giving something in return. To simply let it in. For most people with the overgiving pattern, this is genuinely one of the hardest things they have been asked to do. It feels uncomfortably passive. It feels like owing something. It feels like a vulnerability they have not been trained to manage. But here is the research finding that makes this urgently practical. Studies on marital satisfaction conducted by the Gottman Institute over more than 4 decades have found that the single greatest predictor of relationship longevity and depth is not the absence of conflict. It is what they call the accepting of influence, the capacity to be moved by the other person, to let their offering land and change something in you. The person who can only give but never genuinely receive is not in a full relationship. They are in a transaction, wearing the costume of one. The people who love you want to give to you. They want the exchange to be real. When you deflect everything they offer, when you make sure you never need anything, you are not being low maintenance. You are, in a very real sense, preventing them from loving you in the full meaning of that word. Receiving is a gift you give to the people who love you. It is also, and this takes practice to feel in the body rather than just understand in the head, the thing your nervous system has been starving for since before you can remember. Chapter 5. The Invisible Price of Overgiving. Let's talk about what this pattern actually costs, in specific, measurable, documented terms. Because overgivers tend to be very good at minimizing the cost. They tell themselves they are fine. They point to the meaning and the satisfaction and the genuine value in helping. They say, "It is just who I am," as if that explains why the tiredness is so specific, so deep, so resistant to the usual remedies of rest and sleep and vacation. The research on compassion fatigue, originally developed by the psychologist Charles Figley in the context of trauma therapists and emergency workers, identifies a clinical syndrome that develops when empathic engagement is sustained over long periods without adequate recovery. The symptoms are specific: emotional exhaustion that does not respond to sleep, decreased empathy, a sense of detachment from relationships that previously felt meaningful, hypervigilance in social situations, the nervous system perpetually scanning for what is needed so that it can be provided before a demand is made, a growing sense of resentment that the person experiencing it often cannot locate a justifiable source for, because, on the surface, they chose all of this. The resentment is important to sit with. It is one of the quieter symptoms of the overgiving pattern, and it is one that tends to produce a secondary layer of shame. Because you chose these relationships, you chose to be available, you chose to say yes when you could have said no. And so when the resentment surfaces as it does, the dominant interpretation is that something is wrong with you for feeling it. You are ungrateful, you are selfish, you are not the person you thought you were. But the resentment is not evidence of a character failure. It is information. Resentment, in the clinical understanding developed by researcher and author Harriet Lerner, is a signal that something has been given at too high a cost, that a boundary which should have existed did not, that the giving came not from genuine abundance, but from a felt obligation that had no safe way out. You resent not because you are a bad person, you resent because you have been giving from depletion and calling it generosity. The distinction matters enormously. Genuine generosity has a specific quality. It comes from surplus. It leaves the giver lighter, not heavier. There is a kind of aliveness in it. The thing is given, and you feel more of yourself, not less. What most overgivers call generosity is, in clinical terms, something closer to compulsive self-sacrifice. It comes from deficit, from the felt impossibility of not giving, from a nervous system that has associated withholding with danger and giving with safety. The giver feels relief after giving, not aliveness. The relief of having avoided something, not the joy of having chosen something. There is a further cost that is less discussed. When you give in this compulsive, patterned way, you rob the other person of something important. You rob them of the experience of your actual need. Your actual need, expressed and received, is an act of trust. It says, I believe you can handle, knowing that I am struggling. It says, I believe our relationship can sustain my vulnerability. When you never express it, when you are reliably fine and always managing and perpetually available, you are making a subtle assessment about the people around you, that they cannot hold your weight, that your neediness would be too much, that the relationship is contingent on your performance of strength. And in many cases, the people who love you would be devastated to know this is what you think of them. They have been waiting to be needed, genuinely needed, in the way you are needed, and you have, with the best possible intentions, denied them that. Chapter 6. The Boundary That is also a bridge. The word boundary has been overused and poorly defined in popular culture to the point where it has become somewhat meaningless. It tends to get deployed as a synonym for protection, a wall, something you put between yourself and something that might hurt you. This is not what boundaries actually are, in the clinical and relational meaning of the term. A boundary, in the framework developed by the therapist and author Nedra Tawwab, whose research on healthy relationships is among the most practically useful in recent psychology literature, is not a wall. It is a definition. It is a clear statement of what you need in order to remain in genuine connection with another person. That distinction is crucial, because the overgiver hears boundaries and unconsciously hears disconnection, hears the end of relationship, hears the withdrawal of care. And so the prospect of setting a boundary produces something that feels, in the nervous system, like threat, even when the boundary is entirely reasonable and would in fact be good for everyone involved. Here is the counterintuitive truth that the research keeps returning to. Boundaries do not reduce intimacy. Chronic boundary violations do. The relationships where no one has any boundaries, where everyone is continuously overextending and absorbing and giving without limit, those relationships do not produce the deepest closeness. They produce exhaustion, resentment, and a kind of merged confusion where no one quite knows where they end and the other person begins. What feels like deep connection because of the intensity and the sacrifice is often, underneath, two people using each other for their respective unresolved wounds. The relationships that produce genuine intimacy are the ones where both people can be honest about their limits, where saying, "I cannot do that right now," is received without punishment, where expressing a need does not immediately need to be softened with a reassurance that the other person is not to blame for the fact that you have a need. The reason boundary setting feels so threatening to the overgiver is that historically, in their original attachment environment, it was threatening. There was, in the early family system, something that happened when they needed too much or gave too little. Perhaps it was explicit, anger, withdrawal, criticism. Perhaps it was implicit, a shift in the emotional temperature of the room that the child learned to read with exquisite accuracy. Either way, the nervous system recorded a lesson: when you assert your own needs, something bad happens. That lesson, at the time, was accurate. It was an honest reading of the available evidence. It is not accurate anymore. The people in your current life, the ones who genuinely care about you, are not the people who taught you that lesson. They did not write that curriculum, and they are very likely capable of receiving a "no," a "not right now," or a "this is too much for me," without it ending the relationship or shifting the emotional temperature of the room in a way you cannot survive. Very likely, not certainly, Some relationships, when a person who has always over-functioned begins to function at a more equitable level, do not survive. Not because the relationship was destroyed by the boundary, but because the relationship was built on the imbalance. Some people in your life are there because you are useful to them, and they have never been required to be particularly useful to you, and when you begin to ask for more than you have historically asked for, they disappear. This is painful. It is genuinely painful. But it is also information that was always true and that you could not see while you were holding the whole structure in place. The bridge that a boundary builds is toward realness, toward a relationship that can hold the full weight of both people, that does not require one person to be perpetually strong so that the other can be perpetually fragile. You have been carrying more than your share for a long time. The bridge back to equality begins with a single, clear, gentle, and honest expression of what you actually need, and then staying present while the other person responds. Chapter 7. Attachment and the Pattern That Repeats. There is a reason the overgiver tends to find themselves in the same kinds of relationships again and again. Same dynamic, different cast. The person who needs saving. The person who is perpetually in crisis. The person who drains. The person who takes what is offered without thinking to ask whether there is anything left. The relationship where you are always the one who gives more, calls more, worries more, shows up more. This is not bad luck. It is a selection pattern operating below conscious awareness. Attachment theory, developed initially by the psychiatrist John Bowlby and expanded over the following decades by researchers including Mary Ainsworth and Sue Johnson, describes the internal models we carry for how relationships work. These models, built in early childhood through repeated experience with primary caregivers, operate as a kind of relationship template. They tell you unconsciously what a relationship is supposed to feel like, what the normal emotional temperature of closeness is, and what the available role in any given dynamic is. For the person who grew up in a caregiving role, for the parentified child, for the one who learned that safety required constant giving, the internal attachment model often runs something like this. The familiar, comfortable relational dynamic is the one where I am needed more than I need, where my value is confirmed by my usefulness, where I know what my job is because my job is clear. The dynamic where someone simply wants to be with me, not because they need me to manage something but simply because I am worth being with, that dynamic feels not exactly uncomfortable but somehow incomplete. The nervous system does not know what to do with equal footing. It keeps scanning for the problem to solve, the person to help, the thing to fix. And when nothing needs fixing, there is a low-level anxiety, a waiting for the other shoe, a suspicion that the person who does not seem to need you has not yet discovered that they should. The result is a predictable sorting. The people who present as needy, fragile, in crisis, or simply habitual takers activate the overgiver's nervous system in a way that feels, in the moment, very much like connection, because it is familiar, because the roles are clear, because the giving is immediately required and immediately rewarded. The people who present as secure, who are managing their own needs adequately, who do not require emergency care, who ask simply for companionship and honesty and presence, these people can feel inexplicably flat to the overgiver, not in any way they can justify. They are wonderful people, nothing is wrong with them, but there is not the pull. This is attachment in action. And the intervention, once you see it, is also available in the research. Sue Johnson's work on what she calls emotional accessibility and responsiveness, the foundation of healthy adult attachment, identifies that what people with the anxious giving pattern need is not simply to choose different partners or friends. They need repeated experience of secure emotional contact, of expressing a need and having it received without consequence, of being vulnerable and surviving it, of being, for once, the one who is held rather than the one who holds. This is earned secure attachment, the process of updating the old relational model through new experience that contradicts the original data. It is slower than insight, but it is real. And it begins with the recognition that the familiar discomfort of the unequal relationship is not the same as connection, even though it feels like it, even though the nervous system endorses it loudly. Familiar is not the same as right. And the flatness you feel around secure, available people is not incompatibility. It is the discomfort of being close to something your nervous system was never taught to trust. Stay a little longer. Let the flatness pass. What you are calling boring might actually be peace. Chapter 8. The Secret Life of Resentment. We need to talk about resentment more carefully. Because in the overgiver's emotional vocabulary, resentment is usually filed under things I am ashamed of. It is the emotion that seems to contradict the narrative. I give because I want to. I care because I care. I choose these people and these relationships. So where does this feeling come from? This grinding, low-level accumulation of something that feels very much like I did not want to do any of this, and I cannot say that out loud. The philosopher and psychologist William James described emotions not as reactions to events, but as information about the relationship between what we want and what we have. Resentment, in this framework, is not an accusation against another person. It is a signal from your own interior about a disparity between what you gave and what felt voluntary, between what you said you were fine with and what your actual body and nervous system were fine with. The overgiver has usually developed a fairly sophisticated capacity to override the early signal, the first small no that arises before the yes comes out, the slight internal contraction that precedes the cheerful "of course I can." These signals exist, they always did, but the override mechanism is well developed and fast, and in many cases the person does not consciously register the no before the yes has already been spoken. The resentment is the accumulation of all those overridden no's. Lerner describes it as the feeling of having given our power away and not having an acceptable narrative for why we did it. The overgiver cannot say, "I was afraid to say no," because that would require acknowledging the fear. They cannot say, "I said yes because I needed to be needed," because that would require acknowledging the dependency. And so the resentment sits, homeless, in the body, occasionally surfacing as impatience or irritability or a disproportionate reaction to something small that is really a reaction to years of accumulated unspoken no. Here is what resentment is not. Resentment is not evidence that you do not love the people you resent. You can love someone deeply and resent the dynamic that has developed between you. These are not contradictions. The resentment is about the pattern, not the person. Here is what resentment is. Resentment is a map. Every specific pocket of resentment you carry is a data point. It marks a place where a boundary was not held, where a yes was given that should have been a no, where the override mechanism fired and overruled something that deserved to be heard. If you are willing to sit with your resentment rather than over it, if you are willing to follow it back to its specific source rather than generalizing it into a vague guilt about being a difficult person, you will find, at the end of each thread, a specific moment, a choice that did not feel like a choice, a yes that felt like the only available option, a time when your needs were visible to you for just a moment and then were immediately set aside. That moment is worth examining. Because the version of you that existed in that moment deserved more than was given, not from the other person necessarily, from yourself. The internal acknowledgement that your need was real, that it was reasonable, that honoring it would not make you a bad person. The resentment will not dissolve through more giving. This is the trap. The instinct when resentment surfaces is to overcompensate, to give more, to prove to yourself and to the relationship that the resentment was unjustified, to reestablish the identity of the generous, stable one. It does not work. It adds another layer of unexpressed no to the pile. What dissolves resentment is honoring the need that generated it. Not loudly, not dramatically, not necessarily in a conversation with the other person at all. Sometimes simply in the private interior acknowledgement. That mattered. I was tired. I needed something. That was real. That acknowledgement alone, offered to yourself with the same warmth you would offer it to someone you loved, begins to clear something that years of giving forward have not been able to touch. Chapter 9. The Return to Yourself. Everything we have covered so far has been archaeology. The excavation of how the pattern formed, what it costs, what it protects, what it prevents. This is necessary work. You cannot change what you cannot see, and seeing it clearly, naming it precisely, following it back to its origin, releases something. The pattern goes from feeling like your fundamental nature to feeling, for the first time, like something you learned, something built, something that could, with genuine attention and patience, be modified. Now we move from archaeology to architecture. The question is not what happened to me. The question is, what do I want to build? The psychologist and researcher Richard Schwartz developed a model of the internal landscape called internal family systems. At its core, it describes the human psyche as composed of multiple parts, each with its own voice, its own role, its own set of fears and goals. The overgiving pattern in this framework is understood not as the totality of who you are, but as one part, a protective part, one that took on enormous responsibility very early and has been doing its job ever since, at great personal cost, out of a genuine desire to keep the whole system safe. This part deserves, before anything else, to be thanked. Not ironically, genuinely. The giving, the caretaking, the showing up, the strength, the reliability, the capacity to hold more than seems humanly possible, none of this was weakness. It was the most remarkable adaptation available to the version of you that built it. It kept you in relationship when relationship was necessary for survival. It earned you love when love felt contingent. It gave you value in a world that was unclear about your value. It served you. And now you are beginning to ask whether you could be served by something else. The return to yourself is not an abandonment of care. This is the most important misunderstanding to address, because the overgiver, when they begin to explore the possibility of doing less, almost immediately reaches for a story about becoming selfish, about abandoning the people who rely on them, about failing the identity they have built their entire adult life around. This is the old nervous system talking. This is the Fawn Response reframing change as threat. The return to yourself does not require you to stop caring. It requires you to include yourself among the people you care for, to extend to yourself, consistently and without condition, the same attentiveness you have been extending outward for years. What this looks like in practice is small. It does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with noticing. Noticing when the override mechanism fires, when the no becomes a yes before you have finished feeling the no, when the "how are you doing" produces the automatic fine before you have checked to see whether fine is accurate. Noticing is not acting. It is prior to acting. It is simply restoring the gap between the stimulus and the response that the fawn pattern collapses to nothing. Inserting a breath, a moment. The question, is this what I actually want, or is this the pattern? You do not need to answer the question every time you notice it. You only need to stay with it long enough to feel the difference between the two options, between the giving that comes from genuine fullness and the giving that comes from fear of what happens if you do not. That difference, felt in the body rather than known in the head, is the compass. Over time, with practice and patience, the internal landscape shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but there is a growing familiarity with yourself as a subject rather than a resource. A growing capacity to be in a room and know that your presence is the gift, not your usefulness. A growing ease with the silence between doing and being that used to feel like falling. You do not disappear when you stop managing everyone else's experience. You appear for perhaps the first time. Chapter 10. Learning to Need Well. Needing is a skill. This is not a sentence most people have encountered before, because in the dominant narrative, needing is something you grow out of. Children need, adults provide. Emotional maturity, in the popular understanding, means needing less, not more. This is developmentally backwards. The attachment research is unambiguous. The most emotionally mature, the most resilient, the most functional and genuinely connected adults are not the ones who need least. They are the ones who need clearly and ask honestly and receive gracefully. The capacity to need, to know what you need, to express it directly without either over-qualifying it or escalating it into crisis, to allow another person to try to meet it, and to respond to their effort with genuine acknowledgement. This is a sophisticated emotional competency. It is also the competency the overgiver was least likely to have been taught. Because needing, in the environments where the overgiving pattern forms, was rarely modeled well. It was either modeled as crisis, the parent who needed so much and so urgently that the child learned to associate need with overwhelm, or it was modeled as prohibition, the family where needs were private, where strength meant not asking, where the visible display of emotional requirement was a source of embarrassment or conflict. So you learned the options available. Either need dramatically and produce crisis, or do not need visibly at all. The second option was safer. You chose it. You have been choosing it ever since. Needing well is the middle path that was never demonstrated to you. It sounds like this: I have been having a hard time lately and I would really like to talk about it. Or, I am feeling overwhelmed and I need some help this week. Or, the simplest and most radical of all, I am not okay. Not said as a crisis, not escalated to catastrophe, simply accurate. A statement of the interior to another person who is capable of receiving it. The psychologist John Gottman, in his research on what he called bids for connection, the small and large ways humans reach toward each other, found that one of the primary predictors of relationship health is the consistent pattern of turning toward bids rather than away from them, and critically making bids, asking, reaching. The overgiver has become expert at responding to other people's bids, at turning toward, at meeting the reach with an open hand. The deficit is in the making of the bid, in the reaching toward, in the willingness to be the one who says, I need something from you right now. Start small, not with the deepest, oldest, most frightening thing, with something real but manageable, a specific thing you need, a specific person you trust, even partially, a single sentence that begins with I and ends with something honest. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to provide context or justification or reassurance that you are usually fine. You do not need to apologize for it. You only need to say it, and then stay present long enough to let the other person respond. The first few times will be uncomfortable. The nervous system will want to immediately repair it, to take it back, to say, "Never mind, I am fine, actually." Let that impulse exist and do not act on it. Wait. Let the reach stay in the air long enough to be met. And notice what it feels like when it is. Because it will feel like something you have been hungry for without knowing the name of the thing you were hungry for. Like a conversation happening at the right depth for the first time. Like being seen rather than relied upon. Like being, for a moment, not the strong one. Just a person, in need of another person, which is exactly what you always were. Before the armor, before the pattern, before the world got hold of you and taught you that love was something you had to earn by being indispensable. Chapter 11. The New Agreement. Every relationship is built on an agreement. Most of the time, the agreement is not spoken. It is established through accumulated behavior, through what gets rewarded and what gets ignored, through who adjusts when there is friction and who holds their position, through the 1,000 small negotiations of daily life that gradually settle into a dynamic. In the relationships of the overgiver, the unspoken agreement has usually been, "I will give more than I need. I will be reliable and available and not too demanding. I will not require too much from you emotionally. In exchange, you will stay." This agreement was made in good faith. It was made from the information available at the time. It was made by a part of you that needed the relationship and did not know another way to secure it. But it is a bad agreement for you and, on reflection, for the other person too. Because the other person, if they genuinely love you and are not simply benefiting from the imbalance, did not actually need you to suppress yourself in order to love you. They loved you or they would have without the terms. They were never asking for what you have been offering. You preemptively settled a negotiation that was never actually demanded. The renegotiation of these agreements is the most delicate and most important practical work that emerges from understanding this pattern. It is not done through a conversation that begins with, "You never show up for me the way I show up for you." That is the resentment talking, and while the resentment is valid, it is not a good starting point for structural change. It is done through behavior, through beginning to show up differently, through saying, "I cannot this time," and letting the relationship process that without emergency management, through expressing a need and allowing space for the other person to miss it, to meet it imperfectly, to need guidance about how to meet it, without immediately releasing them from the obligation. Some of the people in your life will adjust naturally. They have been waiting, more or less consciously, for permission to not need quite as much from you. They will feel the relief of a more equitable dynamic. They will move toward it. The relationship will, over time, become more genuinely mutual, more nourishing for both of you. Some will struggle. The new terms will be unfamiliar and their nervous systems will push back. They will, consciously or not, maneuver to restore the old agreement. A sudden increase in need, a crisis, a subtle guilt. This is not malice. It is their own patterning responding to change. If the relationship is worth it, it is worth navigating this period with patience and clarity. And some will leave, because the agreement was the relationship, and without it, there is not enough shared ground. All of these outcomes are acceptable, even the last one. Because the alternative, which is to continue the old agreement indefinitely, is not free. It costs something every single day. It costs you the portion of yourself that is never seen because the armor is always up. It costs the relationships the depth that could exist if both people were fully present and fully honest. The new agreement is simpler and harder. It is simply, I will be honest about what I need and what I can give. I will ask when I need to ask. I will say no when I need to say no. I will give generously when I have the genuine surplus to give from, and I will trust that the people who can meet me there are the ones worth having. This agreement asks more of the relationship than the old one did. That is not a mistake. Real relationships can hold real people. You are a real person. The agreements you make from now on should reflect that. Closing, the strength that was always there. We are almost at the end of this journey together. And there is something I have been waiting to say to you that I could not say at the beginning because you had to travel far enough to receive it. The strength they always called you is real. It was never a performance. The capacity you have to hold difficult things without breaking, to show up when it matters, to care deeply and intelligently, and with such specific attunement to what others need, this is real. It is not an armor you put on. It is genuinely yours. It was forged in conditions that required the forging, and it is extraordinary, and it belongs to you. What was not real, what was the armor rather than the self underneath it, was the story that this strength required your smallness, that it required your silence about your own interior, that it required the sacrifice of your own needs as the price of being worthy of love. That story was never true. It felt true. It was written with such early authority that it has the texture of natural law. But it was a story, made by a child doing the best possible work with impossible materials. And like all stories made in crisis, it contained essential wisdom wrapped in a specific distortion. The wisdom, giving is meaningful, care is real, showing up for people is one of the finest things a human being can do. The distortion, that this giving must come at the cost of your own visibility, that real strength means needing nothing, that the most you can hope for is to be necessary rather than loved. You are always allowed to need love. You are allowed to need it right now. The specific, non-negotiable, no performance required love of being known fully and accepted fully, not for what you can do but for who you are, the unsettling, embarrassingly ordinary humanity of you, the tiredness and the confusion, and the times you got it wrong, and the times you were afraid, and all the versions of yourself that have never been shown to anyone. That person, the one underneath the always fine, and the always there, and the always managing, that person deserves exactly what you have been giving to everyone else. Not as a reward for changing the pattern. Not at the end of some process of healing that makes you finally ready to receive. Right now, today, as you are, you do not need to earn this. You never did. The strength that carried you here, through all the years of giving and the years of carrying and the years of not quite knowing why you were so tired, that strength was real. But the realest thing, the thing underneath even the strength, the thing the strength was always protecting, is not the strong one. It is just you. It has always been just you. And that, as it turns out, was always enough. Go, not to give something to someone, just to be somewhere. See what it feels like.